My name is Clara Hennessey. I'm 29 years old, and 14 months ago I was standing in a bridal suite at the Ashford Garden Hotel in Millbrook, Connecticut, wearing a bridesmaid dress the color of old roses, when my mother looked at me in the mirror and said, "You were always the ugly one, you know. It's a good thing Diane has the looks in this family." She said it the way she said most things, lightly, without apparent awareness that words have weight when they land, like she was commenting on the weather or the floral arrangements or the thread count of the hotel linens. My sister Diane was in the chair beside me, having her hair pinned into an elaborate updo, and she went very still for exactly 1 second before her makeup artist said something cheerful about the flowers, and the room rearranged itself around the comment like water closing over a stone. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked at my mother's reflection behind mine, and I thought, there it is. 26 years of small and large diminishments, and today of all days, she said the truest version of it out loud. I want to tell you what happened next, because what happened next is the reason this story exists. But first, I need to take you back, because you cannot understand the weight of one sentence without understanding the foundation it was laid on. And I need you to understand the foundation, because some of you are living inside it right now and calling it normal, and it isn't normal. It is just familiar, and familiar and normal are not the same thing. If this is already resonating, please take a moment to like and subscribe, only if it genuinely moves something in you. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where my people are when they find me. For as long as I can remember, there were 2 daughters in the Hennessey household, and they did not occupy equal space. There was Diane, older by 3 years, blonde where I was brunette, effortlessly social where I was quietly bookish, the kind of girl who walked into rooms and made them reorganize themselves around her presence. And then there was me, Clara, the one who read too much and talked too little, and had her father's square jaw and her mother's least favorite aunt's brown eyes and a laugh that my mother once described, without apparent malice, as a little too loud for a girl. My mother, Sandra Hennessey, was a woman who had organized her entire identity around beauty, specifically around being the most beautiful woman in any room she entered. She had been genuinely striking in her youth. There were photographs on the mantel in our house in Westfield, Connecticut that told this story clearly. High cheekbones, green eyes, the kind of effortless photogenic quality that cameras find and hold. She had married my father, Robert Hennessey, partly on the strength of his own good looks, a match of attractive people, practical and social in equal measure. Robert was a civil engineer who worked long hours and came home tired and loved his daughters in the general, slightly distracted way of men who have outsourced the emotional labor of parenting to their wives without fully realizing they've done it. Sandra had expected beautiful daughters. She got Diane, who met the expectation so thoroughly that it seemed to confirm the natural order of things. And then she got me, 3 years later, and I was different. Not ugly. I want to be clear about that because I spent enough years believing my mother's assessment to have finally, at 29, developed the perspective to contradict it. I was different from the template, brown-haired, stronger-featured, more interesting than conventionally pretty, the kind of face that improves with age and requires age to be fully appreciated. But I was not what Sandra had projected, and Sandra was a woman who struggled significantly with the gap between projection and reality. My father never called me ugly. My father never called me anything that deliberate. His particular failure was one of omission rather than commission. He was simply not present enough, emotionally or physically, to counteract what was happening in the house. He worked. He came home. He ate dinner. He watched television. He loved us, I believe, in the categorical and inattentive way I described earlier. He was not a bad man. He was an absent one, which in the specific context of my childhood produced outcomes that were not meaningfully different from bad. The first time my mother said something about my appearance that I consciously registered as a wound rather than a neutral observation, I was 7 years old. We were shopping for school clothes at a department store in Westfield, and Diane and I were both trying on dresses in the children's section, and my mother held a pink one up against Diane and said, "Beautiful," and then held the same dress against me and said, "Maybe a different color for you." It was not the words. It was the pause before the redirect, the implication of the which was, this doesn't work on you the way it works on your sister, and you should know that and factor it into your choices going forward. I was 7. I factored it in. I have been factoring it in for 22 years. Diane was not cruel to me. I want to be careful about that because she is my sister and I love her, and her role in this story is complicated in ways that deserve accuracy. Diane benefited from the differential treatment without designing it. She was the beautiful one in the way that some children are the smart one or the athletic one, a designation that lands on you based on what the family needs to sort itself, and that you inhabit without fully examining what the sorting cost the person on the other side of it. Diane was kind to me in private and occasionally uncomfortable in public, when our mother's comparisons became too visible to ignore. She would change the subject or touch my arm or find somewhere else to be. She was not brave about it, but she was not the architect of it either. The architect was Clara Hennessey, who built 26 years of small diminishments into a structure so familiar I had stopped seeing its walls. And then, on the morning of Diane's wedding to Marcus Webb, she said the truest version of it out loud, in a mirror, in a bridal suite, while a makeup artist pretended not to hear. Let me walk you through what 26 years of being the ugly one actually looks like in the daily texture of a life, because I think people hear that phrase and imagine dramatic confrontations and deliberate cruelties, when the reality is both smaller and larger than that. The reality is 1,000 ordinary moments, each one individually dismissible, collectively forming a blueprint of your worth, as understood by the person who was supposed to be your foundation. When Diane turned 16, my mother took her to a spa in Hartford for a full day. Facials, manicures, a hair consultation with a stylist named Andre, who charged $180 for a cut and apparently changed Diane's life with his assessment of her bone structure. My mother talked about that day for weeks afterward. The way she told the story, it was a rite of passage, a mother-daughter ritual of the highest order, a recognition of Diane's arrival into the kind of beauty that deserved professional attention. When I turned 16, my mother gave me a $40 gift card to a drugstore and said, "Maybe look at the skincare section. It doesn't hurt to start early." I was 16 years old, and my mother gave me a skincare gift card as a birthday present and framed it as preventive maintenance. I used it to buy mascara and a novel and said thank you. When Diane graduated high school in 2010, my mother made a scrapbook. 47 pages professionally printed at the photo shop on Elm Street, filled with photographs of Diane from birth through graduation with captions in my mother's handwriting. She gave it to Diane at a graduation party attended by 34 people with a speech about how proud she was of the woman Diane was becoming. The speech made 3 people cry. I was 14 and I sat at the edge of the gathering and ate potato salad and thought about how I had 4 years left before my own graduation. My graduation scrapbook had 11 pages. I counted them the day she gave it to me. 11 pages and a cake from the good bakery on Route 9, which was genuinely an improvement over a grocery store sheet cake, and which I acknowledged to myself required some revision of the lasagna and 6 people story I'd been quietly preparing. But 11 pages. 47 versus 11. I am an English teacher now, and I assign a lot of weight to what people choose to document and what they choose to leave out. The clothing disparity was consistent and specific enough to constitute a policy. My mother took Diane shopping regularly, seasonally, with genuine investment and enthusiasm. She knew Diane's sizes, her preferences, the specific wash of denim that worked on her, the necklines that suited her collarbone. She took Diane to proper clothing stores with fitting rooms and patient salespeople. She took me, occasionally and reluctantly, to outlet centers, with a budget she mentioned frequently, and she had a habit in fitting rooms of saying things like, "That's fine," in the voice that meant functional rather than beautiful. Fine was her word for me in clothing stores. Fine covered a multitude of quiet diminishments. My father bought me a car when I turned 17. I want to be fair and include this. A 2005 Subaru Forester, reliable and practical, chosen by my father with no input from my mother and presented without ceremony but with genuine utility. I drove that car for 8 years. I loved that car. My father chose it by himself on a Saturday while my mother was at a friend's birthday lunch. And I have always suspected that the absence of Sandra from that transaction was not entirely coincidental. It was one of the cleaner acts of love my father managed in my childhood, and I received it as such. But the car was an outlier in a pattern that was otherwise consistent, and the consistency is what shapes a person. One good birthday doesn't cancel 20 ordinary ones where the candles are blown out with less ceremony than the dog's adoption anniversary. The social performances were their own category of instruction. My mother had a way of introducing Diane and me at social gatherings that I only fully analyzed in therapy at 24, but had been feeling since I was approximately 10. When she introduced Diane, she touched her arm and said her name with a particular warmth and often added something. My beautiful Diane, or Diane, who just, followed by an accomplishment or an attribute. When she introduced me, she said my name cleanly, without the touch, without the addendum, and then moved the conversation forward. I was introduced as Clara. Diane was introduced as Diane who. The difference is small enough to dismiss individually and enormous enough to internalize over a decade. I internalized it. I became, by my mid-teens, a person who entered rooms prepared to be overlooked, who dressed for functional rather than beautiful because beautiful had been implicitly designated for someone else, who had developed a specific and well-practiced technique for making herself useful in social settings because useful was a category she was allowed to occupy without competition. I helped with food at parties. I drove people home. I remembered things, birthdays, preferences, the name of a colleague someone had mentioned once 3 months ago, because being the person who remembered things was a value proposition I had available to me that didn't depend on my cheekbones. I became the reliable one. I became the competent one. I became, at 25, an 8th grade English teacher at a middle school in Millbrook where I was, by the consistent account of students and colleagues, and a principal named Howard Briggs who hired me and told me 3 years running that I was the best teacher in his building, genuinely excellent at my job. I built a life I was proud of, not because my mother approved of it. She told me regularly, in the oblique way she had, that teaching was a sensible choice for someone without other obvious options, but because I had found, in a classroom full of 12-year-olds who needed someone to see them clearly, the exact work my particular formation had prepared me for. And then there was Marcus Webb. Diane met Marcus at a conference in 2021. He was an architect, 32, from a family in Portland, Maine. Quietly successful, self-possessed, with a dry humor and a quality of attention I noticed the first time I met him that I can only describe as thorough. He looked at people when they spoke, fully, without the restless peripheral scanning of someone waiting for a more important conversation. He was the first person Diane had dated seriously whom I actually liked, and I liked him with the particular relief of someone who had been introduced to a lot of Diane's previous partners and had been professionally polite about each one while privately noting their deficiencies. Marcus and I had a natural ease with each other from the beginning. We talked about books and architecture and the specific frustrations of working in fields that required you to fight for the value of things that didn't have an obvious price tag. He asked me real questions about teaching, the kind that suggested he understood it was difficult and interesting work, rather than a default option for people without ambition. He made Diane laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in years. He was, by every measure I trusted, a good person and a good match for my sister. When they got engaged in March of 2023, I was genuinely happy. Not performed happiness, not the careful management of complicated feelings, actual, uncomplicated happiness for my sister and the man she had chosen. I was asked to be maid of honor. I said yes. I meant it. I did not anticipate what my mother would say in a bridal suite mirror on a Saturday morning in August of 2024. I should have. The pattern was 26 years established, but you always hope a little, even when the evidence argues against hope. The morning of Diane's wedding was the kind of August morning that Connecticut occasionally produces as if to remind you why people have historically chosen to live there. Warm without being heavy, the light coming in at that particular late summer angle that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. The Ashford Garden Hotel had given the bridal party a suite on the third floor with tall windows overlooking the garden where the ceremony would take place at 4 o'clock, and from where I stood I could see the white chairs being arranged in rows by two young men in matching polo shirts, and the flower arrangements going up along the aisle, and the whole beautiful machinery of a wedding being assembled piece by piece in the morning light. There were 6 of us in the suite: Diane, me, our cousin Rachel, 2 of Diane's friends from college named Priya and Beth, and our mother Sandra. There was also a makeup artist named Gwen and a hairstylist named Tomas, who worked in the comfortable, professional quiet of people who have spent years in rooms full of women managing significant emotions. Champagne had been opened. Diane was in her robe. Music was playing softly from a portable speaker, something instrumental and gentle that someone had curated specifically for this morning. It was, by every available measure, a beautiful start to a day that should have been entirely about joy. I was at the vanity mirror doing my own makeup when my mother came to stand behind me. She had been dressed since 8 that morning. Sandra Hennessey was constitutionally incapable of being anything other than the first fully assembled person in any room, and she looked, I will give her this, genuinely lovely. A deep blue mother-of-the-bride dress she'd had altered twice. Her silver blonde hair in a low chignon, the pearl earrings she'd worn to every formal occasion for 30 years. She looked at me in the mirror with the assessing expression she had used my entire life, the one I had long ago learned to identify as the prelude to a redirect or a qualification. I saw it coming in the half-second before she spoke. She said, "You clean up nicely, Clara." I said thank you. I kept applying my mascara. She tilted her head. She said, "The dress is flattering. Better than I expected, honestly." She paused. She looked at Diane, who was now in the styling chair with Tomas pinning sections of her hair with focused concentration. She looked back at me, and then she said it, lightly, without apparent awareness. "You were always the ugly one, you know. It's a good thing Diane has the looks in this family." The room changed, not loudly. There was no gasp, no record scratch, no dramatic suspension of the music. It changed in the way rooms change when something true and terrible has been said in them. A slight thickening of the air, a quality of stillness that settled over everyone present like a held breath. Gwen, the makeup artist, became very interested in her brush set. Priya took a sudden focused interest in her phone. Rachel, my cousin, looked at me with an expression that was equal parts horror and the specific helpless sympathy of someone watching an accident from too far away to intervene. Diane went still, just for 1 second. Her eyes found mine in the mirror, briefly, and in them I saw something I had seen before. The familiar private discomfort, the wish to be somewhere else, the not bravery that had characterized her relationship to our mother's cruelties for as long as I could remember. Then Tomas said something about the placement of a pin, and Diane's attention returned to the mirror in front of her, and the moment folded itself away, as moments like that always did in my family, into the general fabric of things that happened and were not addressed. My mother moved away from the mirror. She sat down on the small settee by the window with her champagne and began talking to Beth about the garden ceremony setup, her voice carrying the easy brightness of a woman who has said nothing wrong and knows it. I finished my mascara. My hand was steady. I had spent 26 years developing a steady hand for moments like this one. What I felt was not, in that moment, primarily anger. That surprised me when I examined it later. What I felt, standing at that vanity mirror in an old rose bridesmaid dress with my mascara wand still in my hand, was a kind of crystalline clarity. The kind that comes when something you have always half known is finally said plainly. She had called me the ugly one, and the room had absorbed it and moved on, and that was the entire mechanism, laid out in full working order for anyone who wanted to see how it operated. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. I looked at my face, my square jaw and my brown eyes and my particular features that had been a disappointment for 26 years. And I thought, I am a good teacher and a loyal sister and a person who shows up, and I am standing in this room on my sister's wedding day, and my mother just called me ugly and the room moved on. Is this the version of this day I am going to carry for the rest of my life? I decided it wasn't. But I also decided something else, which was equally important. I was not going to make a scene in a bridal suite on my sister's wedding morning. I was not going to damage Diane's day, which was not Diane's fault, with a confrontation that could wait until the day was over. What I was going to do was be present, be the maid of honor, do my job, and at the right moment, which was not this moment, I was going to stop being the person in the room who absorbed things quietly and called it grace. I put the mascara wand down. I turned from the mirror. I picked up my champagne glass and I said, to the room in general, in my normal voice, Diane, the flowers in your hair are going to be incredible. Tomas, that placement is perfect. And I meant it, and the room breathed again, and we moved forward into the morning. What I did not know, standing at that vanity mirror, was that the moment had not been as contained as I thought. Marcus Webb's family was staying in the suite directly adjacent to the bridal suite, separated by a shared interior door that someone had propped open earlier in the morning to allow for easier movement between the two rooms. The groomsmen were using the adjacent suite as a staging area, and Marcus himself had stepped out of his own preparations to drop off a piece of jewelry, a bracelet that had belonged to his grandmother, which he'd arranged to have delivered to Diane as a something old. He had knocked on the interior door at approximately the moment that Tomas was working on Diane's hair. He had been standing in the doorway, bracelet in hand, for perhaps 45 seconds before my mother spoke. He heard everything. I didn't know this until after the ceremony. I didn't know it during the cocktail hour, or during the dinner, or during the first two toasts. I found out at the precise moment the third toast was delivered, which was not a planned toast, which was not on any timeline or program, which was delivered by the groom himself. 20 minutes into the dinner reception, while I was sitting at the head table eating my salmon and trying very hard to simply be present in the day, I had promised myself I would not ruin. Marcus stood up. He tapped his glass. The room went attentive in the way wedding rooms do, the specific happy alertness of guests expecting warmth and humor and sentiment. Marcus had already given a planned toast earlier in the evening, a beautiful one about Diane, full of specific and loving detail that had made her laugh and cry simultaneously. So when he stood again, there was a small murmur of pleased anticipation, the assumption of an addition, a postscript of feeling. He looked at Diane first. He said, I already told you most of what I need to say, but there's something else. He paused. He looked down the head table. He looked at me, and he said, in a voice that was clear and warm and carrying to every table in the room, I also want to say something about Clara. I put down my fork. He said, I have watched Clara for 2 years. I watched her be the person who remembered everyone's coffee order and drove the extra 40 minutes when someone needed a ride and wrote Diane's rehearsal dinner toast at 11 o'clock the night before because Diane was too nervous to finish it herself. I watched her be the person who showed up, consistently and without acknowledgement, for every single thing this family and this wedding needed. I watched her be, without question, the most quietly extraordinary person in every room she entered. He paused. The room was very still. And I want her to know, and I want everyone in this room to know, that being in this family has been the great privilege of her life is something she has earned entirely on her own terms, with a grace that most people in this room, myself included, could stand to learn from. Clara, you are not a footnote. You are a foundation, and I am honored to be your brother. The room applauded. Several people cried. Diane was crying. Priya and Beth were crying. My cousin Rachel was crying and also gesturing at me in a way that suggested she wanted to discuss this later in significant detail. I was not crying because I was still processing what had just happened, which was this. A man I had known for 2 years had stood up at his own wedding and, without naming what my mother had said, had publicly, irrevocably, and permanently corrected the record. I looked at Marcus. He raised his glass at me, briefly, privately, with an expression that said, I heard her. You deserved better. This is the best I could do today. I raised my glass back. I held it very steady. My mother was sitting 3 seats down the head table. I did not look at her directly, but in my peripheral vision, I watched her face do something complicated. A series of small, rapid adjustments. The expression of a woman recalibrating her understanding of what had just happened in a room full of people who had heard it. The party continued. The music started. People danced. And the thing that had been said in a bridal suite mirror that morning was no longer just between the people who had been in that room. I had decided in the bridal suite that morning that I would not make a scene on Diane's wedding day. I held to that decision through the ceremony and the cocktail hour and the dinner and Marcus's toast and the dancing that followed, and it was one of the more disciplined things I have done in my adult life, because by 9 o'clock that evening I was carrying something that needed to be set down, and the only question was where and when and how. The where and when resolved itself at 10:15, when my mother found me. I was on the terrace outside the reception hall, alone for a few minutes with a glass of water and the night air, which had cooled into the particular freshness of a Connecticut August evening. I heard the door behind me, and I knew before I turned around that it was her. Clara Hennessey has a specific quality of movement in social situations. Purposeful, slightly performative, the walk of a woman who is always aware she might be observed. I turned around. She looked, for the first time in my memory, slightly uncertain, not remorseful. I want to be precise about this, because remorse and uncertainty are not the same thing. Remorseful is what you look like when you understand you have done something wrong and feel genuine sorrow about it. Uncertain is what you look like when something has not gone the way you expected and you are recalibrating your approach. My mother looked uncertain. She was holding her champagne glass with both hands, which was unusual. She said, "Marcus's toast was unexpected." I said, "It was." She said, "I'm not sure what he was referring to." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "I think you know exactly what he was referring to." She made a small gesture with her glass, a dismissive motion, practiced, the physical equivalent of, "That's not what I meant." She said, "I was just being honest this morning. I've always said honesty is important in families." I said, "There's a difference between honesty and cruelty, Mom. You told me I was the ugly one on my sister's wedding morning, in a room full of people, like it was a weather report." She said, "I was making an observation." I said, "You were telling me what you've always thought of me. And the thing is, I've known that my whole life. You've been telling me in 100 different ways since I was 7 years old. Today, you just said it plainly." She was quiet. The garden below the terrace was dark now, except for the string lights wound through the hedges, and the music from inside was a low pulse behind the glass. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her before, something that was working its way towards something more complicated than recalibration. She said, "I didn't mean to. I don't think of you as—" She stopped. She started again. "You've always been very capable." I said, "Capable. Right." She said, "That's a compliment." I said, "It's the word you use for things that work reliably. You use beautiful for things you love." The silence that followed was the longest of any conversation we had ever had. My mother looked at the string lights in the garden, and I looked at her, and I thought about 26 years of drugstore gift cards and 11-page scrapbooks, and the in the department store, and the word fine in fitting rooms, and the 1,000 ways a woman can tell her daughter what she is worth. I said, "I don't want to have a fight tonight. This is Diane's day, and I love Diane, and I am not going to damage it. But I need you to hear something." She turned back to look at me. I said, "I am done absorbing this. The comments about my appearance, the comparisons, the way you introduce me versus the way you introduce her. I have been done for a long time. I just didn't say so. I'm saying so now. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it is going to be one where you speak to me with the same basic regard you'd show a stranger. That is the minimum. It is not a high bar, but it is the bar." She said, "I'm your mother." I said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you instead of just walking away." She didn't respond to that. She looked at her champagne glass. She said, "Marcus had no business." I said, "Marcus had every business. He heard what you said, and he did what the people in my family should have been doing for 26 years. I'm not angry at him. I'm grateful to him." My mother's jaw tightened briefly and then released. She said, after a long moment, "I'll think about what you've said." I said, "That's all I'm asking tonight." She went back inside. I stood on the terrace for a few minutes longer and breathed the night air and let the conversation settle into the shape it was going to take. Diane found me 20 minutes later. She had clearly been crying again, though she'd repaired her makeup with impressive efficiency. She came and stood beside me at the terrace railing and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I heard most of that." I said, "I figured." She said, "I should have said something this morning," when she said it. I said, "It wouldn't have been the first time you didn't, and I understand why." She turned to look at me. She said, "That's not, Clara, that's not okay. My not saying something is not okay." I said, "No, it isn't. But tonight is not the night for that conversation either. Tonight you should go back to your husband." She looked at me for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been let off a hook she knows she didn't deserve to be let off, and who intends to address that debt properly. She put her arms around me and held me tightly and said, against my hair, "You are not the ugly one. You are my favorite person." I said, "I know." She pulled back and looked at me. I said, "Go dance with Marcus." She smiled, her real smile, the one she'd had since we were children, the one I loved. She went back inside. Marcus came to find me about 30 minutes later. He was loosened up from a full evening, jacket off, tie slightly loosened, the relaxed happiness of a man who has had a very good day. He leaned on the railing beside me and said, without preamble, "I should have checked with you before I did that." I said, "You don't need to apologize for that." He said, "I want to make sure you're okay." I said, "I'm better than I've been in a long time, actually." He said, "She had no right." I said, "No, she didn't." He said, "Diane told me it's been like this for years." I said, "Most of my life." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know the thing that got me? The way everyone in the room just moved on. Like it was nothing." I said, "I've been moving on from it my whole life. You were probably just less practiced." He looked at me and he said, "Well, I'm not practiced, and I'm not going to get practiced, not with my family." I said, "Thank you, Marcus." He said, "You're my family now, Clara. That's just how this works." The consequences of that evening extended well beyond the terrace. My Aunt Patricia, who had been at the wedding and had heard Marcus's toast, called my mother the following Monday. I was told about this call by Rachel, my cousin and Patricia's daughter, who described it as one for the ages. Patricia was the family member who had watched Sandra operate for 40 years with the resigned familiarity of a sibling who has long since stopped expecting change, but occasionally, when the provocation is sufficient, finds her voice. The provocation of a son-in-law standing up at his own wedding to publicly and specifically validate the daughter Sandra had spent decades minimizing was apparently sufficient. Rachel said the call lasted 45 minutes and that her mother's voice had carried through the wall of their house in a way that gave her a fairly complete picture of its contents. My father called me that week, too. Robert Hennessey, who had spent 26 years in the comfortable fog of inattention, called me on a Tuesday night and said, with the slightly formal delivery of a man reading from internal notes, "I want you to know that I think Marcus's toast I think it was right. What he said. About you." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "I should have paid more attention. Over the years. I know that." I said, "I know you know." He said, "I'm sorry, Clara." 3 words. He said them in the careful and comfortable way of a man who doesn't say them often, which meant they had cost him something, which meant they were real. I said, "I hear you, Dad." He exhaled. We talked for 20 minutes about small things, my school year, his retirement plans, a fishing trip he was planning in October. Small things, but real, in the tentative first step way that real has to start somewhere. The change in my mother has been slower, which I expected. Sandra Hennessey is a woman who built her operating system over 6 decades and does not reboot quickly. But there have been signs, small and significant in equal measure, that the terrace conversation and Marcus's toast and Patricia's phone call and perhaps some private reckoning of her own have produced motion in a direction I hadn't dared expect. She called me in October, 3 months after the wedding, and said she was seeing a therapist. She said it quickly, in the same way my father said, sorry, at some cost, therefore real. She said she'd been going for 6 weeks and that some things were becoming clearer to her. She didn't elaborate. I didn't press. I said, I'm glad, Mom. She said, I have a lot of work to do. I said, yes. She said, I'd like to have lunch, if you're willing. I said I was willing. We have had lunch 3 times since October. They are careful lunches, imperfect and navigated with the specific care of 2 people who have a lot of history and are deciding, together, how much of it to carry forward. She has not repeated anything like what she said in the bridal suite. She has, on 2 occasions, said something that was a compliment without a qualification attached. Just a clean, direct expression of something positive, which from Clara Hennessey is a significant development. Once she told me my haircut suited me. Just that. No redirect. I said thank you and meant it in more directions than she probably understood. Diane and I are closer than we have ever been. The debt she acknowledged on the terrace she has been paying in the currency of showing up. More calls, more honesty, more willingness to name things in our family that we used to collectively paper over. We had a long conversation in November, the 2 of us, about what it had been like growing up on our respective sides of our mother's measuring tape, and it was the most honest conversation we had ever had. Diane cried. I didn't, much. I had been processing this material for a long time. But I held her hand across the table and I told her I didn't blame her, and I meant it. And I also told her that I needed her to be braver going forward when she saw things happening, and she said she would be, and I believed her. Marcus is simply the best addition to my family I have ever experienced. He sends me book recommendations. He calls me when he and Diane are coming to Millbrook and asks if I want to have dinner the night before so we can catch up without the family performance. His words, accurate and affectionate. He is the brother I didn't have and the witness I didn't know I needed, and he materialized in my life not because I asked for him, but because my sister had the extraordinarily good judgment to choose him, which is one of the things I love her most for. It is October of 2025 now, 14 months since the morning in the bridal suite and the evening on the terrace, and the moment Marcus Webb stood up at his own wedding dinner and said the words that rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of my family. 14 months is long enough to know whether things have genuinely shifted or whether you are simply living inside the hopeful aftermath of a significant event, mistaking the quiet for healing when it is really just the temporary absence of the next wound. I can tell you, with the considered confidence of someone who has been paying close attention, that the shift is real. It is incomplete and imperfect and ongoing, the way all real shifts are, but it is real. Let me tell you what my life looks like now, concretely, because I have learned that the concrete details are where the truth lives. I am still teaching 8th grade English at Millbrook Middle School, and I am still, by Howard Briggs's annual assessment and my own considerably harder internal grading, very good at it. This year, I have 23 students, and among them is a girl named Addie Fontaine, who is 12 years old and quiet in the specific way that I recognize from the inside. The quiet of a child who has learned to make herself useful rather than visible, who helps without being asked and volunteers for the tasks nobody wants and writes with a precision and feeling that stops me mid-page when I'm grading. I have been paying specific and deliberate attention to Addie Fontaine. I have been telling her, directly and regularly and with the specificity that matters, exactly what I see in her work. Not good job and not very capable. Exactly what I see. I am doing for Addie Fontaine what I wish someone had done for me at 12, which is to look at her squarely and say, I see what you're doing here, and it is extraordinary, and you should know that clearly. That is, I think, the most direct and useful thing this story has produced. Not the terrace conversation, or Marcus's toast, or my mother's therapy, or any of the dramatic architecture of the 14 months since the wedding. The most direct and useful thing is a 12-year-old girl in Millbrook, Connecticut, who has a teacher who knows what it costs to be overlooked and has decided that cost stops here, in this classroom, with this child, right now. I am living in the same apartment in Millbrook that I have lived in for 4 years, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building on Clement Street, with good light in the mornings and a small balcony where I have, over the past year, developed an entirely unexpected investment in container gardening. I have tomatoes and herbs and, this past summer, a small rosebush in a large pot that bloomed in July with the specific, uncomplicated determination of a plant that does not require anyone's permission to be beautiful. I sat on that balcony on a Sunday morning in July with my coffee and my book, and I looked at the rosebush and I thought, yes, that's it exactly. The financial picture is straightforward and stable. I earn $61,000 annually, which in Millbrook is sufficient, and in the context of my own history represents a kind of solid, self-built ground that I do not take for granted. I have no debt. I have a savings account that I contribute to monthly with the same regularity I apply to everything I care about maintaining. I am not wealthy. I do not need to be wealthy. I need to be solvent and free. And I am both. Now let me tell you where everyone is, because the where are they now is always the part that matters for understanding whether the story meant anything beyond its own events. Marcus and Diane are living in Portland, Maine, where Marcus's firm is based, and where Diane has, in the past year, started a small events consultancy that appears to be gaining traction with the specific momentum of something built by a genuinely talented person. They are, by every observable measure, happy. Not the performed happiness of a couple managing their public image, but the real kind. Slightly tired, occasionally frustrated with each other, deeply committed, funny about the small things. I visited them in Portland in July, and we spent a weekend cooking elaborate meals and walking along the water and talking about everything. And on the last evening, Marcus and I sat on their back porch after Diane had gone to bed, and he said, "Is she okay, Diane, with the family stuff?" I said, "She's working on it." He said, "I worry she carries too much guilt about the years she didn't say anything." I said, "She should carry some, not as punishment, just as fuel for doing it differently." He nodded. He said, "That's exactly the right amount." I said, "I know." He smiled. We finished our drinks. We went inside. That conversation is a small one, but it represents something I didn't have before August of 2024, which is a person in my family who talks to me about the real things, directly and without the elaborate social management that has characterized most of my family's communication for as long as I can remember. I did not know how much I needed that until I had it, which is the way it usually goes with things you've been without for a long time. My mother, Sandra. This is the complicated one, and I want to be honest about the complexity because easy resolution is not the story, and pretending it is would disrespect everyone still in the middle of their own version of it. Sandra has been in therapy for a year now. She sees a therapist named Dr. Angela Corso in Hartford on Thursday afternoons, and she has been going consistently, which for a woman who spent 61 years not examining her own interior life, represents a significant commitment of both time and courage. The changes have been incremental and real and occasionally interrupted by regression, because that is how change works in actual human beings, rather than in the clean narrative arc of stories like this one. She will, occasionally, say something that has the old quality, a small comparison, a reflexive qualifier, an observation that carries the ghost of the old measuring tape. When it happens now, I say something, quietly and directly, without drama. I say, "Mom, that." She usually stops. Sometimes she argues briefly. Then she stops. We are both learning new behavior in real time, which is ungraceful and necessary. She called me on my 29th birthday in April. She called in the morning before anyone else, and she said, "Happy birthday, Clara. I've been thinking about you this morning." I said, "What have you been thinking?" She said, "That you turned out better than I had anything to do with, and that I'm going to spend the rest of the time I have trying to make up the difference." It was not a perfect sentence. It was not a full accounting of 26 years, but it was my mother, at 61, attempting to say something true about her own failures, which is more than I had expected from her, and more than I had received from her in any previous birthday phone call. I said, "That means a lot, Mom." She said, "I mean it." I said, "I know." We talked for half an hour. She asked about my students and my balcony garden and the book I was reading with the specific, new attentiveness of a woman who is practicing something she was never taught. My father, Robert, has continued the slow and genuine effort he began with his Tuesday phone call the week after the wedding. He calls every 2 weeks now, which is a frequency that represents a tripling of his previous contact rate, and which I receive not with irony, but with straightforward appreciation, because effort is effort, and I am no longer in the business of dismissing it. He retired in January and has taken up with the specific enthusiasm of a newly retired engineer, the renovation of a boat he bought for $800 from a man in Fairfield. He tells me about the boat in considerable detail on our calls, and I listen with genuine interest because his enthusiasm for it is completely authentic and uncomplicated in the way that some things are when people finally have time to want what they actually want. He said something on a call in August that I've been turning over since. He said, "I've been thinking about how your mother and how things were when you were growing up. I keep thinking I should have noticed more." I said, "You should have." He said, "I know. I'm sorry I didn't." 3 sentences, clean and direct. My father, who communicates in short sentences when he communicates at all, giving me 3 clean sentences of genuine accountability. I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Dad. It matters." He said, "Good." Then he told me about the boat's hull for 12 minutes, and I let him, because that was also love. Rachel, my cousin and Patricia's daughter, has become one of my closest friends in the past year. This is an unexpected and entirely welcome development. Rachel is 31, funny in the dry and specific way I find most reliably satisfying, and she has the family history to understand the context of my life without requiring extensive explanation. We have dinner on the first Thursday of every month at a Thai restaurant in Millbrook that she drives 40 minutes to reach and which she insists is worth the drive. And she is right. We talk about everything. She was the one, over dinner in February, who said something that clarified something I'd been trying to articulate for months. She said, "The thing about your family is that everyone loved you. They just didn't know how to show it to you specifically because you weren't the template." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "That's the most accurate and most insufficient thing anyone has ever said about it." She said, "I know, both things are true." I said, "Yeah." We ate our pad thai. Both things being true is sometimes the most you can ask of an honest description. I want to talk about what Marcus's toast did, beyond the immediate room in the immediate evening, because I've been thinking about it for 14 months, and I think I finally understand it fully. What Marcus did was not, at its core, a dramatic gesture. It was a refusal. He refused to be in a room where something cruel had been said about someone he loved and let the room absorb it and move on. He refused to let the mechanism operate as designed. The mechanism, the cruel comment, the brief stillness, the cheerful redirect, the collective amnesia, had been operating in my family for 26 years without serious interruption, and it operated because everyone in the room, including me, had learned that the cost of interrupting it was higher than the cost of enduring it. Marcus had not learned that. He was new to the room. He had not yet developed the specific tolerance that family builds in you over decades for the things that should never be tolerated. And so he simply refused. He stood up at his own wedding dinner and he named, without naming it directly, what he had heard and what it meant and what I was worth. Publicly. Irrevocably. The reason it worked, the reason it changed things in ways that my own private endurance had never changed things, is precisely because it was public. Private suffering changes the sufferer. Public witness changes the room. I had been privately suffering my mother's measurements for 26 years, and the suffering had made me stronger and more empathetic and better at my job and more attuned to the Addie Fontaines of the world, and none of it had changed my mother's behavior by a single degree. Marcus stood up in a room of 90 people and witnessed me publicly, and my mother's behavior has changed more in the 14 months since than in the 26 years before, because something had finally happened that she could not absorb and redirect. The room had been changed, and she was still in it. I don't tell you this to suggest that you need a Marcus. Most of us don't get a Marcus, and waiting for one is not a strategy I would recommend. What I tell you this for is to say, public witness matters. Being named, specifically and clearly, in a room where the unnamed version of you has been permitted for years, that matters in a way that private validation, however genuine, cannot fully replicate. Find your witnesses. Be a witness for others. Say the thing out loud in the room where it needs to be said. It is harder and more valuable than suffering well in private. And here is what I most want to say, directly, to anyone reading this who has been the ugly one, the difficult one, the capable one, which is what you get called when beautiful is taken, the reliable one, the useful one, the one who shows up without being celebrated for showing up. You are not what she called you in the mirror. You are not the in the department store or the 11 pages or the drugstore gift card. You are not the redirected conversation or the empty space where your introduction should have had an addendum. You are not the sum of what she noticed about you versus what she noticed about your sister. You are the sum of what you have built, which is considerable, and what you have survived, which is more considerable still, and who you have chosen to be in rooms where the easiest thing would have been to absorb it all quietly and call it grace. You are allowed to stop calling it grace. You are allowed to name it for what it is, to the person who did it, in a voice that is clear and steady and entirely your own, not to punish them, not to burn the room down, just to have at last an accurate record. And you are allowed, more than allowed, genuinely entitled, to stand at your own vanity mirror on a beautiful August morning and look at your face, your specific and particular and entirely sufficient face, and think, I am here. I belong here. No required. If this story found you today, please like and subscribe.